Page
I'm on page
62,
62.
end of the second paragraph.
Yes. So let me just mention that for those who are on watching this on YouTube, we are continuing our reading of My Brother's Keeper by Stanislaus Joyce. We are in the second chapter, and it begins with it was one of the stories to which great exception was taken. And with that, I will begin the reading. It was one of the stories to which great exception was taken when in 1912, the tug of war began with Roberts, the shifty manager of the Dublin publishing firm Monsell and Company. My brother's solicitor in Dublin, George Lidwell, pleading with him for a less rigid attitude in respect to changes in his work, said to him, you see, your father, who has read that story and is a man of experience of life, has no idea what kind of individual you're writing about. I was in Trieste, then keeping the Triestine end up. I wrote back suggesting that my brother would have replied, neither do I, but I have my suspicions, and I put them into the story. Tom Kettle, a man whose opinion my brother valued because his Catholicism was an intellectual conviction, not just a phase of nationalism, also declared against the book. He kept saying, oh, I'll slate that book when it comes out. I'll slate it. Can anybody translate what slate means in this case?
Criticize or, be derogatory about it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was a fair fight that my brother accepted, and that Kettle, by and by, would have lost had the First World War not claimed him of one of its wasted victims. My brother pointed out that it was an actual experience, but Kettle waved the reply aside. I know, he said. We all met him. Next reader, please.
I think it was Kettle's words that decided my brother to keep his own title for the story. He wrote to me that he would like to dedicate it to the author of The Voyage of Ophir. That refers to Meredith's poem written on the voyage around the empire taken in 1901 by the Prince and Princess of Wales. But why pitch on poor George Meredith as a typical exponent of English educational methods and their suspected effects? Why not the author of Ralph Roister Doista? My father now became, or had already become, an easygoing canvasser for the commercial advertisements in the employment of the Freeman's Journal. My brother had used this financial background for the makeup of Leopold Bloom. He also did odd jobs in connection with the revision of voting lists and got a few guineas now and then for acting and presiding officer at municipal elections. But these small additions to his pension made still smaller difference in satisfying the most urgent needs of his large family. My brother's prize money from the intermediate examinations, nominally left at his disposal, went in what is far too dignified to call domestic expenses, and served only to confer on the household a month or so of effortless ease, in which my father bloomed again like a wilting flower in the rain. Next, please.
He was always looking for a job, one suitable, of course, for a man that does not want to work. Now, during spells of sobriety, for it must not be imagined that he was not occasionally sober, he would make optimistic calculations of how much he could earn between hopping and trotting. During these halcyon days when he was temporarily, though not bigotedly, on the water wagon, Sundays and holidays were spent, weather permitting, in taking long walks in the lovely surroundings of Dublin. My brother and I were always in the group, which usually included a friend or two of his, for whom he was better than a guide, though there were truer Dubliners than he was. We would stop to look in at the gates of a country house, A delightful spot, my father would say enthusiastically. I wouldn't mind ending my days there. Whom does it belong to, John? Do you know? Well, it used to belong to old so-and-so. Is it the solicitor in Dame Street, you mean? Yes, that's the man. Then would follow the life, death, and miracles of old so-and-so, or it might be scraps of information regarding more important people. The place where Addison used to walk, or Swift's supposed residence, or the house of the infamous sham squire, Francis Higgins, on Stephen's Green, or Surgeon Wilde's house. Oscar was never mentioned, on Merrion Square. He had an inexhaustible fund of Dublin small talk, and my brother shared with him this interest in Dublin lore, which distance and the lapse of time served only to increase. Next.
When friends dropped in on Sundays or of an evening during the week, my father was unaffectedly delighted to see them and unwilling to let them go home, even when the night had worn on. Why, man, the night is young yet. He was genial, amusing, hospitable. He had more talk, more stories, more reminiscences than the rest of the group, and they seemed to look up to him. Of course, they asked him to sing. His voice was still good, mellow, and rather dark in colour, with resonant high tones. Many of the songs he sang were rubbish, such as that insufferable, "Yes, let me like a soldier fall," from which perhaps Verdi got the idea for Di Quella Pira, though the Irish aria will not stand the comparison. Sung not quite seriously, however, for the sake of the high C at the end. But ballads he sang well, and many operatic airs in English, but known by their Italian names. Mapari, very well. Ah, si, ben mio. Salve, dimore. A te, o cara, which I liked best, though he did not think much of it and rarely sang it. My brother, also, was beginning to have a voice, and singers of the past were often discussed as in the dead. In the first years at Trieste, my brother found the same atmosphere in the Tuscan family with whom we lived. Next, please.
The wife of his friend Fancini had been on the operatic stage before her marriage and had sung Sonnambula and other light soprano parts. She always urged my brother to have his voice trained as a sure solution to his difficulties. In the course of these evenings at home, we became acquainted through my mother with a good deal of romantic piano music, Chopin, Mendelssohn, Liszt, Schumann, Schubert. The interest in these moody men, once the idols of the elite, was not so strange for our family as might first appear. Indulgence in moodiness is one of the cheap luxuries of youth. I understood the spell of their melancholy perhaps better than I do in these crude days, and my mother and my brother was evidently not immune to the maladie du siècle either, for Moods was the title that he gave to the first volume of poems, which he began to write about this time or a little later. Towards the ends of the summer holidays, I should stop there and move to those.
Towards the end of the summer holidays that were to furnish either the idea or the emotional environment for the first few stories of childhood I've mentioned, 2 Dominican priests called to see my father. They were shown into the parlor, and when my father appeared, they soon declared the purpose of this visit, couching it in a few words of flattery to his paternal vanity. The results of the intermediate examinations had just been published, and it appeared from them that my brother had again won an exhibition, this time in the junior grade. The 2 Dominicans had come to offer him free board and tuition in a college belonging to their order in the country. My father called my brother into the room, and after explaining the proposal to him, told him that he was to decide for himself. My brother did so without hesitation. He rejected the offer. I began with the Jesuits, he said, and I want to end with them. Whether the decision in itself was good or bad, my father did right, I think, to leave it to his son, for he believed such decisions tempered the will. My brother learned to come to a decision without regretting it. My father called it making a man of him. Next.
The Dominicans, for their part, were not above engaging in a little underhand clerical competition with a rival order, and they were certainly very alert businessmen. The addresses of students were not given in the list published by the Board of Education, only the name of the colleges they attended. To find this out so quickly, especially since my father's traces were not easy to follow, they must have had an informant in the offices of the board, where names and addresses were registered and the trifling entrance fees for the examinations were paid. A late rector of Belvedere College seized the opportunity afforded by an interview with Patricia Hutchins, the author of James Joyce's Dublin, to assert with some emphasis that my brother was given his breakfast at the college. Some other anonymous source adds, also his dinner. But so far as I can recollect, in all the 7 or 8 years I remained at Belvedere College, breakfast was never served there for anyone. It was a mistake, said the same misinformed spokesman of his order, although well meant by Father Henry at the time, to educate a boy here when his background was so much at variance with the standards of the school, cultural and religious. The suggestion was Father Conmy's, not Henry's. We were then at one of the Christian Brothers schools, and Father Henry didn't know us. I remember my classmates. If by cultural background he means independent out-of-school interest in literature, music, painting, religion, history, or even politics, my cultural background, not to speak of my brother's, was considerably higher than that of my classmates, and by a complexity of causes, as much a result of our kind of family life as theirs was of their kind. In fact, this is a very cheap boast, but their cultural background hardly went beyond tennis and dinner jackets. To me, at least, it seems that there is a reasonable suspicion that this is just the cultural background that the rector of Belvedere College had in mind. Next, please.
Clerical orders, the most unabashed beggars in the country, exposed a little later by Michael McCarthy in his Priests and People in Ireland, monopolize secondary education, thrive on it, and yet consider it a favor if they impart it. That, at least, is the attitude of the Jesuits of Belvedere College towards the end of the towards the most brilliant pupil their school has produced in over 100 years. Even as a boy, he won 3 exhibitions, and twice in the middle and senior grades, he won the prize for English composition. In any civilized country in Europe, the son of a large and impoverished family, we were 10 at the time, is admitted free of school fees to the state schools as a right, not as a favor, and it is high time secondary education was in secular hands in Ireland too. About the time when we moved into the house in Richmond Street, and so when I was between 9 and 10 years of age, an incident took place which was typical of Jesuit educational methods and had considerable influence on my religious background. One day, the rector, Father Henry, sent for me without any reason that I have ever been able to imagine. He began by asking me questions about my work in class, which aroused some forebodings, but soon changed to more intimate questions. Though he was a priest, and there seemed to me to be nothing unusual in his turn of questions had taken, I was a good deal bewildered. Then changing again, he began to question me about my brother's morals. And such was and is the dominance of the priest in Irish life that it never entered my head that he had no right to do so. Next, please.
At any rate, I could not answer because I didn't know, and I said so. It was something new that I had not thought of. He seemed to suspect that I was evading his questions, for he warned that it was in the confessional. and that the lips of a priest are sealed. He was a sallow-faced man with jet black hair and a deep voice. It was rumored among the boys that he suffered from heart disease and might drop dead at any moment. Looking at me with the searching, suspicious eyes of a fanatical convert from Protestantism, and laying his fingers solemnly on his lips, he promised that no word of what I might say would ever pass them. He spoke earnestly. He was reputed an eloquent preacher. And the most terrible of sins, the sin of telling a lie to the Holy Ghost. I was impressed. I tried conscientiously to remember something in the Holy Ghost line, but could think of nothing but some horseplay between my brother and a hoydenish young servant girl we had then, a kind of catch-can-come spanking match. So I hocked that out for the Holy Ghost benefit, hoping it would be enough of an account. The rector evidently thought it was, for he dismissed me and sent me back to my classroom. Another hour was already half over, but the teacher, the Jesuit of course, asked me no questions either about my long absence or about the lesson for the day. I sat there with my head in a maze, obviously almost oblivious of the curious glances of my companions, and much more upset than I had been during the cross examinations. The following day, the rector sent for my mother, and without alluding to any specific fact or mentioning me, gave her clearly to understand that she should watch her elder son, who was inclined to evil ways. My mother was astonished and shocked, but at the same time incredulous. On her return from the college, she said only that the rector had called her to speak to her about Jim. Floundering in doubt whether or not it was a sin to speak, I told her about the long interrogation of the day before, omitting nothing. But though in the course of my account I mentioned the pledge of secrecy, as in the confessional, it was still only remotely and in the vague background of my mind that I felt, not so clearly as words expressed, that I had been put upon, and there had been some breach of faith. I was too young to appreciate the subtle but useful difference between in the confessional and as in the confessional. In any case, at that time, there could be no shadow of a doubt in my mind that in such a matter a priest, especially a stern and devoutly pious rector of the college, could not be wrong. But my reactions lose nothing by being slow. Next.
My mother was certainly not pleased with what she had heard, but in a way she was relieved, for from the rector's earnest admonitions she had been led to fear worse things. Of course she blamed the servant, who was a girl of 23 or 24, and so about 10 years older than my brother. She had already left us, and we never had another. My mother had long before that time ceased to confide in my father about anything, but he observed that something was amiss and inquired what the hugger-mugger was about. I am under a cloud at school, said my brother. What about? Asked my father. I don't know, said my brother. You had better ask the rector. My father went to the college, but again the rector limited himself to solemn but vague warnings. That boy will give you trouble, the rector told him. No, he won't, said my father, because I won't let him. Neither of them knew whom he had to deal with, but for years after, intermittently, until my brother left Dublin, my father would rehearse the story of the rector's thrust in his very own clever parry. Nobody seemed to think that I had done anything at all open to criticism, but I was uneasy and brooded on the trouble in which, under duress, I had been an unwilling agent. Next, please.
As for my brother, he just laughed at me and called me a fathead. His imperturbability, not only at home, but in various interviews with the rector, was far beyond his years and deeply angered the rector, who considered it a mute challenge. It is true he had just won a second exhibition and was studying hard to win a third. My father, apparently guessing nothing in spite of his reputed shrewdness, cursed the rector's tawny soul roundly every night for putting the boy off his studies. The boy, however, was not put off his studies. He applied himself to them quite regularly. My brother never undervalued himself, that is certain, but it is not a sufficient explanation of his calm. To judge by his unaffected imperturbability, he might have been assisting at a badly rehearsed comedy that did not concern him. That cold, lucid indifference which, he says in a portrait of the artist, reigned in the boy Stephen's soul after his first sexual experiences, seemed never to forsake him. But I fancy there was a further reason. I fancy he grasped at once what I understood only long afterwards by brooding on it, that the rector had gone perilously near a breach of the vowed secrecy of the confessional, and that he had the rector in the hollow of his hand. He knew he was the victim of a Jesuit intrigue, and was coldly determined to out-Jesuit the Jesuit. Even at that early age, the rumpus could not throw him off his balance. He gave proof even then of that wariness in fence that later stood him in such good stead in his struggle with hostile authorities in various lands and in times of upheaval. Next.
The storm blew over as unexpectedly as it had sprung up because of the two people who had the matter in hand. One had already said too much and the other had kept her counsel. But it was the beginning of an almost open hostility between the rector, Father Henry, and my brother, which lasted until my brother left Belvedere. The hostility, however, was mainly one-sided. I find no trace of it in the portraiture of the rector in the Belvedere chapters of A Portrait of the Artist. My brother considered him the victim of his own fanaticism, and in any case, justice towards the characters of his own creation or imaginative recreation became an artistic principle with him. That year or the next, my brother won an exhibition in the middle grade, as well as the coveted first prize for English composition. But though the other teachers were smiling and congratulatory, the rector was silent. It is interesting to note that in the middle grade, his marks in mathematics were high. He was placed about 13th in Ireland, so well as I remember. Next, please.
Joe, you need to turn on your microphone. There you go.
I've got a problem here. Could I ask Lois to just take it?
Sure. Yeah, of course. Lois?
Right. Mm-hmm. He detested mathematics. It was his weakest subject, but he tackled it resolutely because he wanted to win an exhibition, and he succeeded. He had, in fact, the kind of cleverness which is supposed to be distinctive of successful lawyers, that of acquiring at short notice, when necessary, a temporary mastery of some subject in which they have not a particle of personal interest. Before we left North Richmond Street, my brother and I were often invited to go on Sunday evenings to the house of schoolfellows of ours, the Shees, who lived not far from us on Mountjoy Square, in a locality which seems to have declined as a residential quarter. This friendly relationship lasted some years and was practically the only experience of what might be called social life that my brother had in Dublin. The father was a member of Parliament, and the family consisted of 2 clever brothers and 4 clever sisters, one of them a really handsome girl. David Shee, the father, was a vigorous-looking man who lived to be about 90. I liked him, but my brother thought him pompous and inclined to lay down the law. He preferred the mother. I must still have been a young boy when we first went there, for I remember a girl student, a university friend of the eldest sisters, who took possession of me and talked to me almost all the evening about gymnastics and sport. I was a minor member of the college team, which had won the inter-school shield for gymnastics, and she, a pretty girl with a lithe figure, was keen on sport too. To me, she appeared to be a young woman, but I was captivated, and disappointed time after time not to meet her again. On another occasion, after I had been partnered with his youngest daughter in a dance by Mr. Sheehy, we both sat, when the dance was over, on separate arms of a large armchair, she looking west-southwest, and I looking east-southeast. Next.
Are you ready to come back, Joe, or will I pick it up?
Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, thank you. My brother, for his part, never lost his poise, and though generally rather distant in manner, he was treated with easy familiarity as between successful students by the Sheehys, brothers, sisters, all of whom were then or later university students. The eldest son was professor in the University of Galway when he died. My brother was not only the most brilliant pupil in the college, and at that time at least of exemplary diligence, but also an omnivorous reader in English and French. He was heterogeneous and mostly his heterogeneous and mostly unorthodox reading often surprised them and was the subject of good-natured raillery. To improve his French, he corresponded with some student in Beer, Calvados, whose name he had got from one of the many societies for improving Anglo-French relations. As the second daughter, Margaret, was just then beginning to make a name as an actress in amateur theatricals, charades were frequently arranged. My brother, too, almost always took part in them and discovered a real talent for mere clowning, unsuspected in so serious a youth. Besides which, his voice was already developing, and though the Sheehys were not musical, he was often asked to sing.
Until his 14th or 15th year, he studied regularly according to the school curriculum, and altogether was in danger of becoming the model of a serious schoolboy in the higher classes, were it not that the works he borrowed from the Capel Street Lending Library sometimes seemed to the librarian open to question for a boy of his age. One of the books against which old Grogan, the librarian, solemnly warned my father was Tests of the Dubervilles. My father had no notion what the kind of book it was or who the author might be. His own taste in literature wavering among the Tom Burke of ours, Frank Fairley, and for breathtaking interest, the Moonstuff. What kind of book is this I hear you were reading? He asked my brother. I've read many. What do you mean? Old Grogan was saying something about the last book you took out, said my father. What? Tess of the Dubervilles. It's by Thomas Hardy. So I have to ask old Grogan what I am to read. The ignorant old clodhopper. He'd be much more at home in his native bog than in the library. I have a good mind to write a letter to the corporation about it. Next, please.
Well, if you say it's all right, said my father, easily convinced. The cut of the easily convinced. As my father often made old Grogan, who had just the cut of a hedge schoolmaster, the butt of his mimicry, the librarian was sacrificed conversationally on the altar of freedom of thought. But I, too, very nearly became involved as another comic victim in this first brush with the censor. The Capel Street Public Lending Library was a mile or so from where we lived, and my brother, with the excuse that he could not spare time from his studies, used to send me to change books for him, giving me a list of other books in order of preference in case the one he wanted should be out. Second or third on the list he gave me after the librarian's ineffectual attempt to act as censor was the name of another of Hardy's works, Jude the Obscure. I did not know the book, and when halfway to the library I glanced at the list, I could not read the name aright. In my brother's scribbled handwriting, it looked like Jude the Obscene. I puzzled over it, but there seemed to be no doubt about it. The more I looked, the surer I was that that word was obscene. At first, I thought that I would say the book was out, but even in my own eyes, I did not wish to be found in the rebellion declared against the librarian. Fortunately, the first book on the list was in, for I had screwed up my courage to the sticking point and was quite determined to call for Jude boldly by the title as I read it. When I came home and told my brother about my dilemma, he shouted with laughter. He was sorry, he said, that I did not have to ask for it. He wished he could have been there to see old Grogan's stupid face and my stupid face when I asked for Jude the Obscene. Very nice.
Are you passing the torch, Katrina?
Yes, I am.
Okay. By the time we had already moved once more, the new house was in Windsor Terrace, Fairview, near the road that winds round the wide, shallow mouth of the Liffey to Clontarf. It was the second last house on the left at the top of parallel rows of two-storied houses, bordering on the rather extensive grounds of some invisible suburban villa, and belonged to a young clergyman named Love, a long-suffering Christian, who it is to be hoped had other sources of income. He makes a brief appearance in Ulysses. We remained for some years near the sea, next to removals being in the immediate neighborhood. Clontarf, the scene of one of the most famous battles in Irish history, was within easy reach by tram. The name Clontarf means the meadow of the bull, and the bull is the long sand bank, which at high tide is completely cut off from the coastal road by a narrow channel of water. The uneven green turf of this sandy islet, overgrown with bushes and bitter-tasting bent grasses, had attracted golfers, who built a little clubhouse, putting greens and artificial bunkers on the bowl, stretching out for more than half its length. Seaward, a breakwater, partly submerged at high tide, ran far out to the river mouth. Here, as before, we used to spend the long summer holidays, bathing almost every day, when the weather was fine and the tide served. The whole family often picnicking at the end of the bowl or on Howth Head, which we could reach on foot from the tram terminus at Dollymount. Haunting memories of this wild little frequented strand, with its tang of sun-baked seaweed and stinging sea breezes, occur in various places in my brother's work, but chiefly in A Portrait of the Artist, where it is the scene of Stephen's sudden resolution to live his life as an artist freely and boldly. Next.
Until 14 or 15 years of age, as I have said, my brother had been a docile and diligent pupil. But from this age onward, his systematic studies, which had followed the prescribed curriculum obediently, gradually gave way to a line of reading, as my father generally preferred to call it, his own choice. The last examination, for which he studied regularly, was the middle grade. He used to go up to our room a couple of hours after our return from school at about 3 and remain there until 10 o'clock, when he would come down in high humor for some light supper before going to bed. And that refers to his mother, to Stephen. Get Dilly to make you that boiled egg every night after your brain work. Meanwhile,
Does your text actually say egg?
Rice. Where did I get egg? Out of rice. I don't know.
I guess you think that egg is more brain food than rice is.
I guess so.
It's probably egg fried rice.
You're
Sorry.
where am I?
Sorry, Johnson.
Meanwhile,
Let's see. For some light humor, for light supper before going to bed. Meanwhile, yes.
Oh, here, I'm up higher. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Meanwhile, on 4 or 5 nights a week, I had the pleasure of my father's drunken company in the kitchen or in the parlor. I had succeeded somehow in winning a book prize on the preparatory grade, a small credit with a bookseller of which a student could avail himself. But it was considered unworthy of any mention at home. Next, please.
My own private impression at the time was that the examiners had given me some other fellow's marks by mistake. In spite of the book prize, I went through the school year and others without some of the principal textbooks. I had a rather good memory and used to cram during the brief intervals and even during the lessons, and generally succeeded in getting the smattering that was sufficient unto the day, like the evil thereof. I had a special grudge against the Greek grammar by a Jesuit, Father Brown. I remember too that the rector, Father Henry, who was our teacher for Greek, altogether disregarded the accents. With my classmates, I earned the reputation of being a hard case, an adept at cribbing exercise under the teacher's very nose, and unblinking under exasperated tirades and threats when I did not succeed in getting away with it. In the end, I managed to scrape ingloriously through examinations. The school hours were hours of high tension, and there was little relaxation at home. It does not facilitate a boy's study to have a drunken man at the other side of the table asking him, "Are you going to win?" "Well, I'll try." "That'll do, that's all I want," repeated about a dozen times. And then again, da capo, "Are you going to win?" "I'll try." How long the third degree examination continued with the same question and answer, I do not remember, but certainly long enough to seem incredible to people who are not familiar with the imbecility of drunkenness, the malodorous mixture of partial paralysis and semi-insanity. In the end, the Chinaman, hard case, collapsed in tears. Afterwards, my mother arranged that I was to study in the room I shared with my brother. Next.
Another more boisterous interlude to homework comes back to my memory. The evening when my father and the skipper of a fishing smack, both very drunk, brought each other home. This sea captain was reported to be the one who had taken James Stephens, the Fenian organizer, away to France in 1865 after his escape from Richmond prison. The story was that he had brought James Stephens, dressed as a woman and disguised as his bride, aboard his fishing smack. The vessel was stopped and searched by an English cruiser in Dublin Bay shortly after setting sail. With presence of mind, Stephens, apparently in great distress, clung to the captain, who appealed to the officer in charge of the search party not to frighten his newly married bride. And that gallant officer and gentleman apologized for the trouble he had given them and let the vessel proceed on her way. Unfortunately, my admiration went not to the quick-witted Irish skipper, but at least equally to the gallant English officer and gentleman. Next, please.
At the time I speak of, Captain was a stocky man with a pointed grey-white beard, who walked steadily even in his cups, but seemed to be invaded by a kind of rigor vini that made it necessary for him to move all of a piece when he turned this way or that. I have in my mind's eye the picture of him sitting stiffly on my father's knee, like a ventriloquist stooge, while they crooned in unison, "I dream of thee, sweet Madeline." Every now and then my father would interrupt the duet to pluck the captain's beard and shout, "Whoop! You're the best bloody man that ever scuttled a ship." The rickety chair gave way under their double weight, and they fell sitting to the floor. After this abrupt end to the concert, the captain took his leave with dignity, without forgetting his umbrella, which had stood in the corner of the room. I observe that it is usual in the scientific jargon of our days to classify such people as weaklings. But if the story about the captor was true, and it probably was true, though he himself always avoided speaking of it, he had risked a long term of imprisonment in a minority cause and shown presence of mind in the face of danger. My father, for his part, had been a more than average all-round sportsman and an amateur actor and singer immune to stage fright. He lived to be 83 and had more than a dozen children. If such people are weaklings, the word must have very elastic connotations. Lois?
In such circumstances, I had little wish to study, and even my brother's inflexibility of purpose seemed to weaken. I used to read a good deal, for the most part plodding in my brother's tracks. He devoured books, while I was a slow reader. It sometimes surprised me, however, to find both that my brother remembered little or nothing of most of the books he read so voraciously, and that, at need, he could make good use of the one or two things he did remember from his reading. He read quickly, and if the book or the author did not appeal to him, he forgot them both. If a book did, on the contrary, make some impression on him, he tried to read as many by the same writer as he could lay his hands on. Whenever I struck out for myself, I always felt a little guilty, as if I were indulging in inferior taste. That questionable taste included Scott and Dickens, whom my brother could not stand. In fact, I read 10 or 12 of the Waverley novels running and cried, "Hold, enough," only when I reached Count Robert of Paris. This habit of reading in tandem continued when we were in Trieste. Not, of course, for all books. He read far too much for me, but for many, and even for some foreign authors. My reading, which had to serve instead of regular study, may have been useful to him as a kind of revision, for occasionally in our endless discussions, I happened to point out things he had passed over and to re-arouse his interest. He said frankly that he used me as a butcher uses his steel. The note is to "Where is your brother?" Apothecary's Hale. Oh, my whetstone, Ulysses. There is an example of this revision in Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus sends Malachi Mulligan a telegram which runs, "The sentimentalist is one who would enjoy without incurring the immense debtorship for a thing done." My brother had paid no particular attention to the epigram when he was reading The Ordeal of Richard Feverel. To me, struggling to understand the sentimentalists by whom I was surrounded, one of whom wept when he sang the bells of Shandon, it seemed far too superficial to dismiss their sentimentalism in such bewildering contrast with their conduct as mere silliness. Meredith's epigram was a sudden illumination, and I drew my brother's attention to it. At least I could think I now understood why I detested the bells of Shandon, as well as those other old favorites, The Lost Chord, and Thou art passing hence, my brother. Next.
I cannot, of course, remember the religious crisis, which is the central theme of a portrait of the artist. The impression it leaves is that it was an actual experience, and I have a vivid memory of many outward signs that confirm this impression. The long talks at the college, not with the rector, but with the preacher of the Lenten sermon, Father Jeffcott, who had known my brother at Clongowes College, and with Father Conmee at Gardner Street. A brief interview of friendly admonition with the provincial, the early morning mass which he attended with my mother, after which he would stay on in the silent chapel, where mass had come and gone so quietly, to say another prayer, while his mother whispered to him that breakfast was ready, as well as the self-imposed abstention from sweets, newspapers, and theatres during Lent. I watched these mild austerities with surprise, but without admiration and without any inner urge to emulation. At that age, I was getting on for 14 then, I still went to confession and communion 2 or 3 times a year, at Easter, at Christmas, and perhaps once more at some other time, but always with distaste. I was always more upset by a blunder or a gaffe than by sin. The offence to the Godhead never troubled me, but faults in my relations with others did. When at low mass on Sunday, to which I always went because it is shorter, the celebrant went into the pulpit to denounce the perils of serious mortal sin. His words fell flat and echoless on my ear. I felt that they really meant nothing to the preacher either, that they were so much more gospel gibberish, and that the 20-minute sermon, which bored me into the fidgets, was for him what the weekly English composition was for me, the squeezing of a dry lemon. But I just thought to myself, Father Reynolds is a bad preacher, and that, for the moment, was the end of it. Clearly, James wasn't the only one who had difficulty with the Catholic Church. Next, please.
Shall I read?
Yes, sorry,
please,
Katrina. Yes, please.
Mhm.
Neither had I ever been able to work myself up into anything like religious fervor in regard to Holy Communion. For me, the host was a thing like tissue paper with a curiously tasteless taste that stuck to the palate and had to be dislodged carefully with the tongue. The prayer to be read after communion, which contains the quotation, "Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldst enter under my roof," puzzled me like an ill-timed pun. The roof of my mouth or the roof of somebody's house? Some people are born hypocrites, and some have hypocrisy thrust upon them. The latter was my case then. Of course, it was the body and blood of Jesus. Oh, yeah, of course. And then the idea that it was an act of cannibalism came into my mind, to be bundled in horror out of the door and come back through the window for an answer. It had always been dinned into my ears that Jesus Christ was true God and true man, and that as man he had a human body of flesh and blood. At Mass, the host was converted miraculously for the 100 millionth time into the flesh and blood of Jesus. Those were their words. When I, together with other boys, was being prepared for my first communion, they had taught us that the Feast of Corpus Christi, one of the greatest festivals of the Catholic Church, had been instituted in the Middle Ages after a doubting priest had found blood dripping from the host over his hands and the altar linen. I could not get away from the conclusion that to deny in the teeth of such common doctrinal instruction that communion was an act of cannibalism, at least in intention, at least in imagination, was downright lying. And there was always the danger of dying suddenly and going to hell if one did not believe, that permanent blackmail for vacillating believers. Of course, one was permitted to doubt, provided it was honest doubt, and one had taken the utmost care to find out the truth of such a supremely important matter. So I supposed after a lifetime of study at 50 or 60, one might venture to harbor doubt about the real presence. Meanwhile, I was in a cleft stick, forced to tell myself lyingly that I believed what in my heart I disbelieved, even with a certain disgust.
All right. And with that, we will end the reading today and go on to a little bit of discussion. Oh my goodness. Hold on. You know what?
Want to finish the
I'm
chapter?
going to force the issue a little bit because we are so close to the end of this chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
yeah, so I'm gonna proceed onward. Although the Lenten sermons preached by Father Jeffcott stirred up no such brainstorms of terror and remorse in me as they did in my brother, I remember that retreat well. I listened to them with something akin to irritation, as one does to a story which one feels to be an invention, but which one cannot disprove. In order to illustrate God's horror of sin and how much it offended him, Father Jeffcott told us that if all the natural catastrophes and all wars and all ills and evils of mankind could be avoided by deliberately committing one venial sin, that would be it would be far, far better not to commit that sin. with a start of anger that deafened me for a while to the rest of his sermon. I thought, a lie, a thumping falsehood. And later, when my anger ebbed, do the sufferings of men not matter? Next.
When I began to listen to him again, when he did not matter, another thought amused me. Approximately, it was this: if it is true that sin offends God so much, considering the amount of sin that is condemned per minute per mile, he must be in a constant state of divine apoplexy, quite inconsistent with celestial bliss. My skepticism regarding the things revealed to one of our fathers had one immediate effect. It startled out of his apathy our lay teacher, Dempsey, Mr. Tate, when he came up from the college chapel. The boys were discussing the latest sermon. One of them told him that Father Jeffcott had said that it had been revealed to a Jesuit saint that the damned were pouring into hell like hailstones. Master and pupils were silent for a moment, awe-stricken. Next, please.
Hailstones fall pretty quickly, said I. That must be about the rate at which people are dying all over the world. I suppose so, said Dempsey, with the indifference of a man who does not realize what he is admitting. And that means, I concluded, in the war between God and the devil for man's soul, the devil is winning all along. Dempsey had been chewing his moustache and listening half amused to the talk about a religious question that he took for granted. Now he woke up. He was very angry to find that he had walked into a trap. I don't want to discuss religion with you. That's not my business, he said sharply. You should ask whoever teaches you Catholic doctrine. But it was the rector that taught us Catholic doctrine, and I had no intention of asking him anything. So I hedged. I don't believe, I said, that we are obliged to accept the visions of the saints as gospel truths. It was not exactly hedging either, for at the time, my groping doubts about Catholic doctrine hardly went beyond the point. Next.
The Reverend Landlord of Windsor Terrace must have been as largely endowed with Christian charity as his name betokened, for our residence at that address appears to have been somewhat longer than elsewhere. I cannot be certain how long my brother's conversion lasted. Rather more than a year, I should say. We were still at Windsor Terrace when the reaction set in, and he came under what was to prove one of the dominant influences of his life, the influence of Henrik Ibsen. It seems to me little short of a miracle that anyone should have striven to cultivate poetry or cared to get in touch with the current of European thought while living in a household such as ours, typical as it was of the squalor of a drunken generation. Some inner purpose transfigured him. Next, please.
One afternoon comes back to me distinctly. The afternoon when Ibsen, master builder, arrived from Heineman's in William Archer's translation with his excellent preface, a slim volume in yellow paper covers with a vignette of Hilda Wandel, alpenstock in hand, on the outside. It was an event, and my brother stayed up that night to read the play. In the morning, I must have been the first to come down, for I found the large armchair pulled near to the extinguished hearth on the table to the armchair. The lamp had been pulled to the edge of the table so that the table cover drooped on the floor. The whole room bore witness that he had read late into the night. My brother had been keeping vigil to hear the message from Norway of the younger generation that sooner or later comes knocking at the door. Professor Joyce is echoing his brother's words at the end of The Day of Rabelais. Everywhere there are men who are worthy to carry on the tradition of the old master who is dying in Christiania. He has already successor in the writer of Michael Kramer, and the third minister will not be wanting when his hour comes. Even now, that hour may be standing by the door.
All right. Great. My goodness.
Hey, Robin.
I had a lot of chuckles during this reading.
Yes.
I will tell you. So the thing that strikes me is this is a book that T.S. Eliot wrote the preface to.
Mm.
And I guess I'm missing something about T.S. because this seems quite contrary in some ways to T.S. Eliot's train of thought, except that they're both Stanislaus and T.S. are a bit on the elitist side, to say the least. But theologically speaking, I find it amazing that T.S. wrote the preface on this.
Well, I wouldn't see any problem with that. Like T.S. Eliot is a convert to Catholicism or to high Anglicanism, but that doesn't mean that you won't touch something written by some guy who doesn't believe the same as you. I see no.
Yeah, no, I understand that actually.
And like he's Joyce's brother. That's the significance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like it's a very important book that it be published.
Yeah. It's continuing to get better and better. In my opinion, it's I'm amazed at how the beginning of it felt to me so clunky.
I think if you go back to the preface that we're talking about, the very first paragraph there, very first sentence, sums up, or rather gives an answer to the question that you posed, Duncan, as to why T.S. Eliot would do this.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I read it?
Yes, please. Yeah, point out exactly what you're talking about.
Curiosity about the private life of a public man may be of three kinds: the useful, the harmless, and the impertinent. It is useful when the subject is a statesman, if the study of his private life contributes towards the understanding of his public actions. It is useful when the subject is a man of letters, if the study throws light upon his published works. That's the key. The line between curiosity, which is legitimate, and that which is merely harmless, and between that which is merely harmless and that which is vulgarly impertinent, can never be precisely drawn. So he's interested in this because he wants to know more about James Joyce's art, would be my interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's actually quite a bit of very interesting points that are made in this reading.
Mm.
Very, very interesting point on page 77.
77.
Second time he said this, Father Henry, and he says, who was our tutor from Greek.
Say again, Joe, sorry.
Yeah, your microphone's a little bit low, Joe.
He's talking about Father Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, Father Henry, who was our teacher for Greek. Because we've heard on other readings that Joyce never studied Greek.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's the second time it's been mentioned.
Mm.
But maybe Stanislaus studied Greek.
He's talking about himself.
Our teacher.
But
Yeah.
that's his class. It could be his class.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't, clearly they're in the same school.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
the same sentence, you know? And I know he studied it later, and I know he knew some modern Greek, but I just take the point there because I've always been puzzled by that. The argument goes that Catholic schools did not teach Greek. They taught Latin, and Protestant schools did not teach Latin. They taught Greek.
Ah.
My classics master at school in the 1950s and 60s was a Clongowes man.
Mm-hmm.
He tended to teach us Latin through Greek, even though we didn't do Greek. But he had clearly done it in Clongowes. And I puzzled, how come they didn't do it? But I just draw the point there that I question that idea that Joyce from an early age had no Greek. I really question that.
If it supports your argument, Joe, I think I said before, I come up from a provincial town called Thurles in County Tipperary and went to the Christian Brothers School, where they taught both Latin and Greek.
Yeah, you see, yeah, and that it was. I mean, it was like we were supposed to do Latin, but we had to basically learn the Greek alphabet because this guy tended to write the Latin words in Greek alphabet.
We used to have that phrase, it's all Greek to me. Yeah. But one of the things that Joyce said was that the Greeks were, he found the Greeks were lucky for him, when he was abroad. And also, of course, he insisted and went to great trouble on the first production of his first book of Ulysses to get the exact color of the Greek flag on the cover. And they had to search everywhere until Joyce was satisfied that this was the precise color. I think the printer eventually found it somewhere in Germany, but he insisted that the book, the first editions of Ulysses, bore the exact color of the Greek flag. Yeah. And had it outside. It had Sylvia Beach had the Greek flag outside Shakespeare and Company as well. Yeah. So yeah, he was kind of a strange connection he had with the Greeks. Yeah.
And in his notebooks for Ulysses, in one of the notebooks, he gives us his first drawing of Bloom. This famous first drawing of Leopold Bloom. Out of his mouth are coming the opening lines of the Odyssey, written in perfect ancient Greek.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
So like we once on this had a case presented to us which pictured Joyce's knowledge roughly of the Odyssey as somewhere like he might have read it in a Dell comic type of thing.
Charles Lamb's child edition.
Charles Lamb, it was where they started the 8 and 9-year-olds. But I just take the point that I mean, I've had my mind changed here because I always thought it was something he learned in later life. Now I'm beginning to wonder. Now he may not have been a particularly good student of Father Henry. He mightn't have worked hard for him. But so it's just point. It's kind of.
Yeah.
But when he talks about Stanislaus, the way if you're forced to learn something you won't remember, well, you might not enjoy it, so you might not remember it. So when Stanislaus talks about like doing it at the last minute, that maybe it wasn't the most enjoyable experience, so he pretended he didn't learn it afterwards.
He may it's always difficult to know with Joyce. I mean, he could have been just kind of embellishing his own mythology by insisting that he didn't know Greek. It's hard to tell. He was this is probably too simplistic of a word. He was a slippery character. And I think he liked to stir up controversy about him as a way of, as a promotional technique.
Yeah. Just getting back to Joe's introduction there about Bray. I mean, I lived in Bray for about 7 years, but one of the things that happened in Bray was Neil Jordan, the film director, lived at number 2 Martello Terrace, which is the house beside where Joyce lived. But while he was there, he made a film, The Miracle, and it's all set in Bray. It's made in 1991. And one of the actors in it was Donald McCann, who plays the part of Gabriel in The Dead. So, yeah, and it's a quite a small film, but it's a beautiful film. And if anybody wanted to have a good look at Bray, it's all there in that The Miracle by Neil Jordan, 1991. And Donald McCann plays a big part in it. So it gives a good look at Bray.
Mm-hmm.
What's the name of it again?
It's The Miracle, and directed by Neil Jordan, and 1991. Yeah.
You might be able to get it on.
You might, yeah, on maybe on YouTube or somewhere, yeah. But it's a lovely film in itself. You know, kind of. But it's all set in Bray, where he lived at the time.
Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed the sentence. This is classic Stanislaus sarcasm. It does not facilitate a boy's study to have a drunken man at the other side of the table asking him, "Are you going to win?"
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good description because, I mean, I suppose most of us have been on both sides of that equation, but there's nothing as kind of irritating or as funny sometimes, but irritating to be in the presence of a drunken person and to keep repeating the same questions or repeating the same stories over and over again. And you're kind of saying, yeah, okay. But we've been on the other side of that as well, you know.
The mystery of his father. I was really thinking about what you said, Tom, last week. I think about it a lot during the week. I even got out the portrait and read the dinner. Yeah, I know it's a novel, but that last half sentence is that there was a tear in his father's eye.
Yeah.
So you were saying, you know, you built a case, and I say, yeah. Years ago, a man in Swinney's, a customer, saw a copy of The Life of Stanislaus Joyce, a second-hand copy, and he put his finger on it and said, "If you want to understand Joyce, read that book." Book about that thick, you know, and I never read it, and now I'm beginning to think I need to read the life story of Stanislaus Joyce.
Oh, it's a biography of Stanislaus.
Yes. You've read it, I think.
Yeah, it's really that person in Swinney's was right. I mean, it's about the father, but I mean, you learn so much about Joyce as well. It's by I used to know that. Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah,
it's got the portrait of.
Yeah, it's that famous picture that. It's John Wise Jackson and Peter Costello.
Peter Costello. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the father. Well, you know, the father, you know, he missed his calling by 100 years. It sounds like his father would be a worldwide celebrity in our culture. You know, with his ability to play and sing and tell stories, you know, he could be a late night TV host or something of that nature.
He could be president.
That's true.
He'd be better.
It was a little sad, though, that poor Stanislaus got a book prize.
Yeah.
Uh, but
It didn't make any impression.
Yeah.
And I also enjoyed the part where he's talking about that he couldn't afford textbooks. So
Yeah.
he would grab other people's textbooks and, read the
Yeah.
material, right? That's actually brilliant.
Yeah.
And it really shows a kind of a brilliant mind to be able to do that.
One of my favorite lines was he was always looking for a job, one suitable, of course, for a man who does not want to work, and now during spells of sobriety.
Yes. I remember that line.
Okay.
Is being on the water wagon not drinking?
Yes.
Mm.
Okay, because I know what falling off the wagon is. It's like if you're doing something.
Falling off the wagon is to go back to drinking.
All right.
So
And
you
the
go on
expression-
the wagon,
Yeah.
which might be a water wagon. I'm not quite sure what the.
Yeah, I never heard water wagon, but I heard wagon.
Yeah, they don't add the water part, but I think the implication was that they would be drinking water instead of alcohol.
Mm.
I like the sentence where Stanislaus is talking about James Joyce and mathematics. And he says he, meaning James, had in fact the kind of cleverness which is supposed to be distinctive of successful lawyers, that of acquiring at short notice, when necessary, a temporary master of some subject in which they have not a particle of personal interest.
I can see someone being able to do that with anything but mathematics. How can you fudge mathematics?
Yeah.
I will just say that in my attempts to master subjects which I had not a particle of interest in, I always discovered that if I got the most basic of textbooks, that and really mastered it. Like at one time, I had to memorize, I don't know, 450 Chinese herbs and all of their indications and counter indications. It was a massive, it's almost like memorizing the Bible. And what I realized was that all I needed to do was to make a card for each one and put down, the top 2 or 3 indications and counter indications, and master those cold. And that would be enough to get through almost anything. And then I just started applying it to other things, which was when I had to deal with some subject that either I wasn't interested in or it was beyond my capabilities, is to get down to the simplest level. So just a guess.
No, that works actually, to get maybe a junior high school level book that gives you all the basics.
Mm-hmm.
And probably in life, for those topics, those particular topics, that's all you really need.
None of my children were any good at mathematics, but I always told them that much more important than anything was to be in the ballpark. Make sure your answer was in the ballpark. Don't have it be off by powers of 10.
But are you saying that 2 + 2 = 5 is close enough?
Yeah.
No, at that level, you can get that much. You can get that much.
I think that is what you said, Duncan.
Okay, well, I will say, I'm being wrongfully misinterpreted.
We get you.
Yeah, what I'm saying is if you're multiplying 20 by 20, you want it to be in the hundreds. You don't want it to be in the thousands.
No, we understand.
Yeah, I was once had I worked in finance, you know, and I had a colleague who was convinced that no matter what project came over your desk, you only needed to know 3 things about it. And once you know 3 things, you can talk, you can give a presentation. So if someone comes in with a cat collar factory, you have 3 things about cat collars is all you need to know, because no audience can hold more than 3 things in their head.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Someone said, we want to build a museum. Okay, what are the 3 things happening in a museum? You know, 3 big things about a museum. And you stand up and say, okay, well, we have it's a 20-minute slot, so I'll just confine myself to 3 things. And they all think you know 30,000 things, but all you know is the 3 things you've researched outside.
Mm-hmm.
And he got to the top on that. I didn't do very well in it.
You know, since you use the number 3, I'll tell you one of my favorite educational jokes. So this was an anniversary gathering of the Harvard graduates of 1968. So the valedictorian and the salutatorian were already there. And in flies the guy who graduated at the bottom of the class. And he flies in his Lear jet. So they're all at the party, and they're talking, and the valedictorian goes over to the guy who just barely made it out of school, and he said, you know, Peter, I do not understand. I was at the top of my class, and you were at the bottom of the class. But, you know, here I am, I'm wearing a very modest suit, and, you know, you have flown in on your jet, and you have got your Armani suit on. He said, can you explain this to me? And the guy said, well, I don't know, Charles. All I know is if you buy something for $1 and you sell it for $3, you'll be amazed how much profit you can make with a 3% markup.
That says it all. That says it all.
Instinct in some cases. All righty. We are 2 minutes away from the top of the hour. Lois, are you holding up your hand? You got something to say?
No,
No?
I'm
Okay.
just looking forward to whatever is going to happen.
All right. That's good. All right. Anybody else got anything to add, say?
This
All right.
this is great stuff. I'm really enjoying it.
It's fun.
I'm not going to be able to remember a lot of it, I don't think.
No.
But
I think you might remember things like, this is about James Joyce. He knew he was the victim of a Jesuit intrigue and was totally determined to out-Jesuit the Jesuit.
Remember, Katrina, all you need are 3 things to remember.
That's right.
So you can
That's right.
discuss
Thank
with
you.
everybody.
Thank you. That's true.
All right. Well, I will exert my host power here. This is my big power thing. I'll click the big red button and everything will go.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. See you soon.
Bye. Good to see you
Thanks
all.
again.